Hold on, I got residual noise behind me. We're back, and once again, it is Gerald Glassford from Pop Culture Cosmos and Game Source. Thank you so much for thank you so much for continuing to listen to our show. It is week 6 in the NFL. Everything is looking fine if you're a lot of teams that are on the up and up. Not if you're the New York Giants, though. Unfortunately, they're on the down low, and it's continuing to slide down. But that's for another day. It's another conversation for another day. But it is, like I said, going to be a great weekend in the NFL. And here to discuss everything out there that fantasy football owners need to know is my good friend. He is the guru of the Fantasy Football Pater podcast. You can listen to full episodes today on our Pop Culture Cosmos channel. Now that's available on Spotify, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and over 30 different podcast outlets. It is my good friend, Mr. Tyler Baker. What's up, man?
How are you doing, my friend? It's always a pleasure to be on the Pop Culture Cosmos.
And it's always great to have you here, commanding the ship, making sure everybody's teams are doing well and prospering, or at least so that you can actually sleep and not feel guilty. At least you give them their good words of advice. If they don't listen and they lose, well, that's not on you.
Yeah.
But, yeah. It is going to be a great weekend in the NFL, my friend. I want to ask you first. I discussed it on our full episode of the Fantasy Football Pater podcast. I was going to, we mentioned that we would go ahead and have you think of some good trade targets out there for people that are maybe need some help or maybe need to shore up some things on their lineup or what have you. What are some good trade targets out there that fantasy football owners need to be made aware of that are attainable? I'm not talking about anybody like trying to trade for Patrick
Mahomes.
Yeah. Good luck on that one. You're not going to probably get it unless you throw everything in the kitchen sink for him.
Sure.
I'm talking about individuals out there that are attainable that will help your fantasy football team down the road.
Sure. Well, I will say, if you can pull a trade for Patrick Mahomes, do it, no matter what you give up. I think he's second only behind Aaron Rodgers, and I only say that because Rodgers is healthy now. We saw him moving around in the pocket really well last week, and Green Bay is going to pass the ball. They don't want to run. So I kind of I still give Aaron Rodgers the edge, but Mahomes has had a couple down weeks, at least from a fantasy point view. So if you could get him, because he's had 2 really tough matchups. He is an absolute star. He's going to be a star for a long time to come. But when you're talking about a trade, you really have to ask yourself, is this trade going to better my team? And how is this trade going to better my team? I'm in quite a few leagues, and I see a lot of trades where I go and I look at who's trading what, and I look and I'm like, why are they making this trade? How, I fail to understand sometimes how these incoming players are actually going to help their team. So you really have to look at what needs your team has, what do you have to give up to get the guy that you want, and then you have to find a trade partner. So trading is a little bit tricky. going into the bye season, as I like to call it. The next couple of weeks, you're going to have a lot of teams on buys, so you're going to want to look ahead and figure out how you can set your team up to do well during the buys. A couple pieces of advice there. One is that receivers are almost a dime a dozen. Any given week, there's a receiver that you can get off of the waiver wire that is going to come in and give you production. And if you get to that point in the season and you need a question or you need a receiver, you can just message me or get on the Facebook page, and I'll be sure to help you with that. So the premium, in my opinion, going into the buys is at running back, because running back is a much more scarce position. And there is value out there. So I looked at how the points are shaping up, at least for fantasy points, and I found a couple players that I think are kind of have more points than they probably should at this point in the season. And those guys, of course, you want to sell high on. I would recommend probably trying to move Isaiah Crowell. He's had a couple big games, but if you look at how they're splitting up that backfield, Bilal Powell is actually getting quite a bit of work there. I think Crowell's numbers to this point are a little bit of an outlier. Crowell is one of the top 10 fantasy running backs in the NFL right now. I don't think he's a top 10 talent. And I think towards the end of the season, he's going to come back to earth. So that's a guy you might want to move. And, if you need to make changes on your roster. Also, James White. Now, you and I have been talking about the James White, Sony Michel situation. And I'm going to stick to what I said several weeks ago, in that at the beginning of the season, at least after Burkhead was gone, you're going to see James White come on strong, and then you're going to see it kind of balance out with Sony Michel getting more involved in that offense as he becomes more familiar with the scheme, and as he begins to gain Tom Brady's trust. Now, I want to say that Crowell and White both have value. I'm not saying they don't have value. I just think they're a little overvalued right now. And so those are guys where, if you're looking for a trade, those are some pieces that you could put out there that their stock is really high, and you could probably get a lot from them. So that leads us to, who do we try to trade for? Well, that's a lot trickier. One name really pops up, and that's David Johnson. You saw Arizona just not using him. They're starting to use him more. Don't forget that David Johnson is one of the best talents at running back in the NFL. It just seems that that Arizona hasn't quite figured that out yet. That will come back around. I'm pretty confident that, barring injury, David Johnson's stock is going to continue to rise. So the David Johnson owner that drafted him in the first round, with probably one of the first 3 picks, is probably really frustrated right now, and is probably willing to move him if you make the right offer. That, in my opinion, is the only uh, big ticket item, if you will, as far as buying low. But there are a couple other guys. I think Kenyon Drake, has kind of been in the doghouse, but if you look at his physical talent versus Frank Gore's physical talent, there's a really big discrepancy there. I have to think that that's going to level out some, and I think that Kenyon Drake is going to be more involved in the offense moving forward. Now, it's really difficult to predict these things. It's difficult to predict game flow. It's difficult to predict scheme, and maybe these coaches are seeing something that we don't see yet, but I do think that Drake's value will go up. Also, Ronald Jones is an interesting one. Now, the first couple weeks there in Tampa Bay, you had the Fitz magic and the glorious fantasy production that came from that. But Jameis Winston's back. The team is coming off of a bye, and right before they went into the bye, Ronald Jones had been inactive the first 3 games, but then the 4th game they let him play. He got 10 touches, and I'll tell you, from what I've seen from Peyton Barber, it's not been impressive. So, getting a little bit of work right before the bye, and then having the bye week, new quarterback coming in with Jameis Winston. That's who they're going to roll with. It seems to me that there could be a change in what they're doing in offense coming out of the bye, and I think that Ronald Jones could be a part of that. Now, we haven't seen it yet, so that's a lot of speculation, but that's a guy that I think I mean, his stock can only go up, and he's probably on your waiver wire right now. So if you have, a spot that you can take a chance on a guy, Ronald Jones is probably one that I know is on your waiver wire. He could break out at some point. And then, of course, there's the ageless wonder, Darren Sproles, and we watched Philadelphia tonight, and I can imagine how much better that offense is with Sproles on the field. Sproles, I'm pretty sure, is on the waiver wire in your league. If you have a bench spot that you can stash him, it might be a really good stash, because if he comes back and he comes back healthy, he's going to be able to do some really good things in that offense.
Those are some definitely pointed words from our guru right here at the Fantasy Football Pager podcast. It is Tyler Baker. You got to check out full episodes today on Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more than 30 different podcast outlets. And also, don't forget the Fantasy Football Pager podcast Facebook group. You sign up, and you'll be part of over 200 fantasy football owners that are out there. If you have any questions in regards to trades, which we just discussed, waiver wire pickups, lineup changes, things of that nature, just go ahead and send it out there and be a part of it. It's the Fantasy Football Pager podcast Facebook group. Just sign up. And like I said, you not only get information and also some advice from Tyler Baker himself, but also a lot of other individuals that are there as well. They want to go ahead and put in their 2 cents if you go ahead and ask a question out there. But it's also an easy way to a direct line to Tyler himself. You can just message him right there through the Fantasy Football Pager podcast Facebook group.
Yeah, and there's some really good fantasy players in that group. I mean, some really good fantasy players. So you might get some different opinions, but sometimes it's more art than science.
That it is. And sometimes it's about, moving that Ouija board, rubbing that rabbit's foot, some little look out there, whatever making sure you don't, cross in front of pardon?
Whatever it takes.
Yes, whatever it takes. Don't cross in front of a black cat, don't go underneath the ladder, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts on the way out, my friend? Because it is going to be a great weekend in the NFL. We've got a lot of good things to point towards including some great fantasy football matchups potentially in Tampa Bay, like you were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. They're at Atlanta, Pittsburgh at Cincinnati. I also am pointing towards a nice scoring option when the Rams go to Denver. Mm-hmm. And I think also as well, Kansas City and New England, they'll probably light up the scoreboard as well. I'm seeing like a game that's going to probably generate about 50 to 60 points as well. What are your thoughts on that? Or also as well, any other games or players that you think anybody needs to know about? There's some injury updates or anything that you want to talk about before we go ahead and wrap this edition up right here on the PCC Multiverse.
Sure. Well, getting back to what I was saying earlier, receivers are kind of a dime a dozen, but I do have a couple sell high candidates, and those are Robert Woods and Golden Tate. Robert Woods is a great receiver. I think his production is a little bit higher than where it should be. And also Golden Tate, he had a really big game a couple weeks ago, but from what I'm seeing in that offense there in Detroit, it's Kenny Golladay. That kid is an absolute stud. Golden Tate certainly has value and still has a role there, but I think he's a little overvalued right now. And coming off of a bye, that's another good selling point if you've got a player that has already had their bye. So maybe you could move Golden Tate and Robert Woods and maybe work a trade out. A couple buy low candidates in the wide receiver category. I like Keenan Allen and a guy that we talked about a couple weeks ago, Kiki Cutie, there in Houston. He's not going to put up stellar numbers. He's, wide receiver 3 with some 2 upside, but he looks like that he's quickly becoming an important part of that offense, and he'll be able to, I think, give you a really good floor every week. As far as some of the games this week, yeah, man, I'm going to be really interested in seeing this Kansas City at New England. Belichick having a long week to prepare. Patrick Mahomes playing really good football. This is going to be 2 of the best quarterbacks in the league. That's going to be a really, really interesting game to watch. This Rams and Denver game, I think it's going to be pretty interesting too. Denver, is really having some problems at the quarterback position, and the Rams in that defensive front is absolutely going to get after. Um, Case Keenum there. I expect there's going to be a whole lot of Philip Lindsay and Royce Freeman. And let's face it, Keenum's going to have to throw the ball. So probably a good deal of Emmanuel Sanders in this game. The Denver defense is good, but the Rams can hit you with so many weapons. It's just going to. I think Denver's going to try not to make it a shootout, but I think that they are going to have to air the ball out. And if it's not all in the air, deep shots, it's definitely going to be a lot of Philip Lindsay and a Freeman. Pittsburgh and Cincinnati is going to be an interesting one. That's a AFC North showdown. I just there's just going to be a lot of fantasy production out of that game. If you have AJ Green and you've been waiting for that big game, this could be it. Then of course Tampa Bay coming off of a bye with Jameis Winston going into Atlanta. Atlanta kind of got stifled last week by Pittsburgh, but Tampa Bay does not have a Pittsburgh defense, so this should be the highest over/under of the week. But that's going to be a really, really interesting game. So a lot of good games this week, and like I mentioned, we're getting ready to go into the buys. You're going to have to look ahead. You're going to have to look at your team, see if you have guys multiple starting positions that have the same bye week, and you're going to need to start adjusting for that. And that might mean freeing up some roster spots. At this point, if you have Drew Brees, he's on a bye right now, but after he comes back, I'm guessing you probably don't need a backup quarterback at that point. So unless you're playing keep away, if you have a really good backup quarterback, try to trade him. If not, maybe use that roster spot instead of having a backup for a really good quarterback that you're going to play every week. It's probably best for you not to have a backup quarterback and use that roster spot and maybe pick up Naheem Hines or somebody like that. That stock could increase, or maybe, like I said, take a shot on Ronald Jones or something. So at this point, as you're going into the buys, you need to plan for them. But as you're coming out of the buys, understand that maybe you don't need some of those backup positions. And if you're worried about tight end, hey man, aren't we all? It's a really bad year for tight ends. I did see that Greg Olsen is practicing and could be coming back. I would use extreme caution with that. They've already said that his foot is going to require surgery. He's gonna try to play some this year, but he had the same foot injury last year. He came in this year, played one game, didn't even get through it, hurt his foot again, and now he's supposed to be coming back. That's a huge red flag. So maybe don't take a chance on Greg Olsen.
Once again, it is Tyler Baker from the Fantasy Football Pater podcast. Full episodes are available on our Pop Culture Cosmos channel, now available, like I said, on Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and over 30 different podcast outlets. Tyler, it's going to be a fantastic weekend in the NFL. So glad you could get everybody prepped for that weekend, and just looking forward to, well, I guess just basically on our Monday show and also next week on our Wednesday program, just basically just sizing it all up. And then, as we always do after that, just looking forward to that, and cannot thank you enough for being part of the show, part of the Fantasy Football Pater podcast, and of course, right here at the PCC Multiverse.